I still remember that summer like it was yesterday, even though it happened almost 2 decades ago. It was 2005. I was 16, and life felt like it was on the edge of something, the kind of moment when you don't realize how much everything is about to change. Back then, I was just a regular kid from a small town in the Midwest. Not rich, not poor, just somewhere in the middle with a tight circle of friends, a shaky but close family, and a little too much time to hang out at the local community pool. That pool was like our second home. Summers meant endless hours swimming, playing games, and laughing until our throats hurt. It was the kind of place where friendships were forged in chlorine and sunburns. On most days I'd be there with my best friend Jake and another buddy Chris. The three of us were inseparable, or so I thought. Jake and I had grown up together since elementary school. We were like brothers, or at least that's what I believed. Chris was the newer addition to the group, but he fit in like he'd been there forever. We did everything together: sports, video games, even sneaking out to the late-night arcade when we thought no one was watching. But that summer, something started to shift. It wasn't one big thing at first, just little moments. Jake started acting different, more distant, like he was holding something back but not quite ready to say it. It began with subtle comments about how I was spending too much time with Chris, and not enough with him. At first, I shrugged it off, telling myself that maybe he was just jealous or feeling left out. I mean, it wasn't like I was ditching him or anything. We still hung out almost every day. The pool was our refuge, but even there the mood changed. Jake, who used to be fearless in the water, suddenly refused to go into the deep end. Chris and I would swim over, teasing him to join, but he always shook his head and stayed on the deck. One day I caught him glaring at us like we'd betrayed him. It was weird because we'd always been a team. I tried talking to him, asking what was wrong, but he just brushed me off. I guess that's when things started to unravel. It was late July, one of those scorching afternoons where the sun was so relentless, it felt like it could melt the asphalt. Chris and I had just swum out to the deep end, splashing around and laughing, when Jake suddenly stormed off the deck. I didn't think much of it until, out of nowhere, a flutterboard, one of those kickboards we used to race with, flew through the air and hit Chris squarely in the back. For a moment, everything froze. Chris gasped and turned around, eyes wide with shock. Jake's face was twisted in anger, and before we could say anything, he took off running toward the parking lot. Chris and I exchanged looks. Our fun day instantly shattered. We climbed out of the pool, dripping wet and furious, ready to confront Jake, but he was already gone. That moment felt like the first crack in everything I thought was solid. What the hell had just happened? Why would Jake, my best friend, do something like that? I replayed it over and over in my head as we dried off and headed home. The next day, I did what any teenager in 2005 would do. I fired off an email. Back then, Hotmail was the king of free email. And I wasn't exactly a tech genius, but I knew how to get a point across. I sent Jake a message, mocking his girlfriend. A petty jab, sure, but it felt like payback. I wanted him to feel what it was like to be crossed. I thought it would be harmless, just a little joke to get under his skin, but I didn't expect the fallout. At school the next morning, I was called into the vice principal's office. My stomach dropped the moment I walked in and saw a police officer sitting there, stern and serious. They told me they were investigating an incident of cyberbullying related to the email I'd sent. I tried to explain everything: how Jake had thrown the flutterboard at Chris, how he'd been acting weird and hostile for weeks, but no one seemed to care. The vice principal and the cop just looked at me like I was the bad guy. When I pushed back, told them they were being unfair, I ended up with a 3-day suspension. That punishment felt like salt in the wound. I was furious, not just at Jake, but at the whole system that ignored what really happened and made me out to be the villain. That's when the anger really took hold. I felt betrayed on every level. Jake wasn't just my friend. He was supposed to have my back. Instead, he stabbed me in it, and no one else saw it for what it was. Feeling cornered and desperate, I reached out to another friend. Mark was the kind of kid who always had a plan and wasn't afraid to push boundaries. Together we started scheming. We wanted to teach Jake a lesson he wouldn't forget. Looking back now, it was reckless and childish, but at the time it felt like justice. After that suspension, the halls of school felt colder than ever. Everyone seemed to have picked sides, or more often just looked away, pretending like nothing was happening. I was stuck carrying this weird mix of anger and hurt, not just because Jake had turned on me, but because the people I trusted didn't believe me. It was like I'd been thrown into a ring and told to fight, but with no one in my corner. Mark was the only one who really got it. He wasn't just another friend. He was my partner in crime, the guy who could see beneath the surface and knew how to push back. I told him everything, how Jake's jealousy had spiraled into something nasty, how I'd been suspended unfairly, and how I was done being the punching bag. We spent hours hatching a plan. The internet was this new frontier back then, and while we weren't hackers by any stretch, we knew enough to get creative. Our idea was simple: hit Jake where it hurt, his pride and his relationships, and specifically, his girlfriend. I'll be honest, it felt a little cruel. We were teenagers, sure, but the desire to get even burned bright inside me. I wanted Jake to feel the same kind of betrayal I'd felt, the sting of losing someone because of lies and deception. We created a new Hotmail account, pretending to be a girl, young, attractive, and mysterious. It was almost laughable how naive and clumsy our messages were, but somehow it worked. At first, Jake didn't take the bait. He was suspicious, brushing off the emails like they were spam. But Mark was patient and persistent. We kept sending messages, pretending this girl was really into him. Then things escalated. Mark managed to hack into Jake's email account. Honestly, I still don't know how he pulled it off. He was that tech-savvy, and I was just along for the ride. Once we had access, we blocked Jake's entry to his own account, locking him out while we ran the show. One afternoon during computer class, Mark and I sat side by side, firing off emails back and forth from the fake account to Jake's inbox, weaving a tangled web of deceit. We made it look like Jake was falling hard for this girl, and planning to leave his girlfriend for her. The thrill of it was almost intoxicating, this secret power to rewrite someone's reality, to flip the world upside down for a guy who had hurt us so badly. We took screenshots of the conversations, and did the only thing we could think of. We slipped those screenshots into Jake's girlfriend's locker. That part was nerve-wracking. The hallways were packed with students rushing between classes, and I felt like we were walking on a knife's edge, but we pulled it off without getting caught. For weeks after, we waited. The tension was unbearable. Every day at school, I watched Jake's face, trying to read the storm brewing behind his eyes. Then one afternoon, Mark found me at lunch, grinning from ear to ear, and told me I had to come outside. My heart pounded as I followed him to the back of the school, where a crowd was gathering. There was Jake standing in the middle of a circle of students, looking completely shattered. His girlfriend was screaming at him, waving the screenshots like evidence in a trial. She was furious, accusing him of cheating, betrayal, and lie. Jake kept insisting, over and over, that his account had been hacked, that none of it was true, but she didn't want to hear it. The look on her face was like pure heartbreak mixed with rage. She told him they were over, and with that she turned and walked away. The crowd laughed and whispered as Jake collapsed to the ground, bawling his eyes out. It was one of those moments that stays burned in your memory forever, the raw, ugly pain of someone breaking apart in front of you, surrounded by strangers. Part of me felt a flicker of satisfaction, a sense that we'd finally won, but deeper down there was this gnawing feeling, a cold pit of regret and uncertainty. Had we gone too far? I don't think I fully understood the consequences then. All I knew was that I'd struck back, and for a brief moment, the balance had shifted. After that day, the school never felt the same. It was like the prank we pulled wasn't just a moment, it became a scar that everyone carried. Jake was a mess, barely showing up to classes, eyes haunted and distant. His girlfriend, she didn't come back to school for weeks, and when she did, the cold stares and whispers followed her like a shadow. And me, I thought I'd feel victorious, but instead I was swallowed by a weight I hadn't expected. The adrenaline rush was gone, replaced by this gnawing anxiety that tightened its grip every time I passed someone in the hallway. I knew people were talking, judging, and maybe even feeling sorry for Jake. Part of me felt guilty, but I buried it deep, telling myself he had it coming. I tried to keep things normal, school, friends, family, but inside everything was fraying. I couldn't sleep, my stomach twisted in knots before every class. I kept replaying the whole chain of events over and over, wondering if I'd crossed a line I couldn't come back from. At home, my parents noticed. They asked if I was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them about the drama. Who wants to admit they were part of a messy, humiliating game of revenge? Instead, I smiled and said I was fine, even though I wasn't.
The principal called my parents one afternoon and invited them to school. I could tell by their faces afterward that the situation was more serious than I'd thought. They wanted to talk about the cyber incident, and the damage it caused, how Jake's mental health was suffering, and how the school was trying to manage the fallout. That hit me hard. Jake was one of my oldest friends, and now he was hurting because of me, or at least because of what we did together. The guilt started creeping in, sharper and more painful than I expected. But even with all that, Jake wouldn't talk to me. I reached out a few times trying to apologize or explain, but he shut every door. The friendship that had been my anchor for so long was gone, and I was left drifting, alone in the aftermath. Meanwhile, rumors swirled. Some kids believed Jake had really been cheating. Others knew the truth but stayed silent. The school atmosphere grew colder. Teachers were stricter about computer use, and everyone seemed more cautious, like they were afraid the next scandal was just around the corner. Mark and I became more careful too. We stopped bragging about what we'd done and avoided talking about it, but the damage was done. The hardest part wasn't even losing Jake. It was realizing how quickly things can spiral out of control, how one angry act can lead to a chain reaction that no one really wins. I spent a lot of nights alone staring at the ceiling, asking myself if I'd become the person I never wanted to be. The idea of revenge had sounded sweet in the moment, but it left a bitter aftertaste that lingered long after the laughter faded. Looking back now, I know I was just a kid trying to make sense of a friendship falling apart, but back then, all I felt was anger and confusion, wrapped up in the chaos we'd created.
That fall, everything felt like it was collapsing under the weight of what had happened. I was walking through a fog, trying to piece together who I was after all that chaos. I wanted to believe that what Mark and I did was justifiable, that Jake had it coming, that he'd betrayed us first. But as the days turned into weeks, the sharp edges of that anger began to dull, replaced by a deep, gnawing emptiness. I spent more time alone, scrolling through early social media sites like MySpace and MSN Messenger, where I tried to drown out the noise of reality by lurking in other people's lives, watching everyone else leave their drama, their highs and lows, while I felt stuck, trapped in my own mess. I started thinking about the things I'd lost, not just Jake's friendship but trust, innocence, and the simple joy of just being a kid without all this bitterness. I realized I hadn't just hurt Jake, I'd hurt myself too. One day, Mark came over with a different kind of energy. He wasn't the cocky mastermind anymore. He looked tired, like the prank had drained him too. We talked for hours, hashing out what we'd done and what it meant. For the first time, we weren't laughing or gloating. We were honest. Mark told me he'd reached out to Jake, tried to explain, but Jake refused to listen. That stung. It meant this wouldn't be fixed easily, if at all. I decided I had to try something different, not revenge, not hiding, but making things right, or at least trying to. I wrote Jake an email. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, pouring out everything I felt, the anger, the regret, the hope that maybe we could move past this. I didn't expect a response, and I didn't get one. Days turned into weeks, and silence was all I had. But I kept at it, sending messages, leaving notes, trying to find ways to bridge the gap. It felt like shouting into a void sometimes, but I couldn't give up. I wanted that friendship back, even if it was broken beyond repair. The hardest part was wrestling with my own conscience. I kept asking myself, was it worth it? Was the revenge worth the fallout? The answer wasn't simple. Sometimes I thought yes, because Jake had hurt me deeply. Other times, I felt ashamed for stooping to his level. There were moments when I wanted to give up, to accept that some things can't be fixed. But I also realized that holding on to bitterness was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to suffer. Eventually, I started focusing on myself, on learning how to forgive, even if it was just for my own peace. I threw myself into schoolwork, sports, and new friendships. Slowly, I began to rebuild. It wasn't a clean break or a fairy tale ending. Jake and I never went back to being best friends, but over time, the anger faded. I learned that sometimes people grow apart in painful ways, and that's just part of life. Looking back, that summer was a turning point, not just for the friendships that broke, but for who I became. It was a brutal lesson in trust, betrayal, and the messy, complicated nature of growing up. Years have passed since that summer, and yet sometimes the memories come rushing back like waves hitting the shore, unpredictable, relentless, and impossible to ignore. I've carried that chapter with me, tucked away under layers of time, but never fully buried. It shaped me in ways I didn't realize until much later. I often wonder what Jake's life has been like since then. Did that moment define him the way it defined me? Did he ever forgive me or even himself? We never spoke again after high school. The friendship, once so tight, unraveled completely, and no amount of apology or explanation could stitch it back together. That story became one of those quiet truths I keep to myself. I don't tell it to brag or seek sympathy. I tell it because it reminds me how fragile trust can be, how a few moments of anger and betrayal can echo for years, shaping who we become. I learned that revenge, no matter how sweet it feels at first, often leaves wounds deeper than the ones it tries to heal. I also learned that forgiveness is less about the other person and more about freeing yourself. It's messy and complicated. Sometimes it takes years to find peace. Looking back, I'm grateful for that painful lesson. It taught me to value honesty, to speak up before things spiral, and to choose empathy even when it's hardest. It taught me that friends aren't just people who stick around when things are easy, but the ones who fight to understand even when everything falls apart. That summer changed me, but it didn't break me. I'm still here, still learning, still growing. And maybe that's the real story, not about revenge or betrayal, but about finding the strength to keep moving forward when the past feels heavy and the future uncertain. So if you ever find yourself in a place where trust is broken and hurt runs deep, remember this: the choices you make next don't have to define you. You get to decide who you become, no matter what happened before, and that's something worth holding on to.